Part 13. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 121. Lingzhou. Nearly half a month has passed since the end of the new year, and in 2 days it will be the new year. The Shangyuan Festival, also known as the Lantern Festival, is the most important and lively festival every year. The prosperity of the Shangyuan Festival is even greater than that of the New Year Festival. Although the Spring Festival has just passed and the spring cold has not gone away, the people of Lingzhou, who have been huddled at home all winter, had already walked out of their homes a few days ago and began to prepare for various programs in Shangyuan. After tonight, the major lantern festivals in the city will begin one after another. During the day, there will also be dragon and lion dances and many other performances to watch. Lingzhou, which has been silent for a winter, will officially kick off the new year after experiencing the excitement of the Lantern Festival. The Prologue. Zongfu. Qing'er held her chin with one hand and watched Fang Xinyu waving a wooden sword in the yard. After watching for a while, she looked away again and murmured, "It's so boring." These days, without the stories about princesses and talented men told by her uncle, the Lantern Festival that she had been looking forward to for a long time seemed to have no meaning. Tang Yaoyao sat opposite her, also supporting her chin with one hand, correcting several of Fang Xinyu's movements, then turned her head and sighed, "So boring." Although only 10 days had passed, it felt like months had passed to her, and she always felt that something was missing around her. When I think about it carefully, I realize that what is missing is not something. That guy has been away from Lingzhou for 10 days. Lingzhou is not far from the capital. If he didn't flirt with women on the way and the trip goes smoothly, he should be almost at the capital by now. The provincial examination is in early March. If he can pass the provincial examination, the palace examination will probably be held in mid-April. Calculating this, he will not come back until early May at the earliest. If he passes the exam, he will stay in Lingzhou for another half year at most, and then go to work somewhere else. Then he will be even more boring in the future. Tang Yaoyao thought of this, and suddenly felt in her heart that she didn't want him to pass the exam. Thoughts? The next moment, she shook her head vigorously, throwing the sinful thought out of her mind, and then she became even more depressed. At the same time, in a room somewhere, Zhongyi looked at a poetry album in front of him, and he hadn't turned the pages for a quarter of an hour. Beside her, Su Ryu, who was originally doing embroidery, may not have moved her hands for a long time. Capital, the Yamen of the Ministry of Rites. During the New Year period, there are many royal ceremonies, and the officials of the Ministry of Rites are the busiest. Even after the New Year, when all the officials take their regular rest, the Ministry of Rites still has many matters to deal with. The Lantern Festival is approaching, and the Emperor will hold a banquet for the officials in the palace on the night of the Lantern Festival. Most of the matters will be handled by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, but when it comes to certain etiquette issues, the Ministry of Rites still needs to assist. At this time, this year's provincial examination is less than 2 months away, so the Ministry of Rites needs to take this matter particularly seriously. Early in the morning, a long queue formed outside the Yamen of the Ministry of Rites. The people queuing up were all candidates who came to the capital from all over the country to take the provincial examination. After they arrived in the capital, they first had to register with the Ministry of Rites, receive their examination certificates, and leave necessary information such as their residential address. In the Yamen of the Ministry of Rites, in a remote duty room somewhere, an official from the Ministry of Rites yawned and asked without raising his head, "Name?" "Zhongsan." "Place of origin?" "Fengzhou, Changhe County." "Fengzhou, Changhe County, Zhongsan." The official from the Ministry of Etiquette picked out one of several thick books, and after searching for a long time, he found Zhongsan's name. After confirming it, he waved his hand and said, "Go next door to get your examination certificate." The candidate immediately bowed and said respectfully, Thank you, sir. After he exited, another person walked in. Name? The official from the Ministry of Rights asked without raising his head. There was no sound coming from the other side. Name? He asked again, but still no one answered. The tedious process already made him very upset. A trace of anger appeared on his face, and he raised his head and said, "What? Is it okay if you are deaf?" Before he finished his sentence, his anger quickly disappeared. Looking at the young man in front of him, a smile immediately appeared on his face and he said flatteringly, "Young master, why are you here in person? Please send someone to say, we can do it for you." The young man waved his hand and said, "Stop talking nonsense and get it done quickly. I still have something to do after that." "Yes, yes, yes." The official of the Ministry of Etiquette nodded immediately, turned around and ordered a servant behind him, "Why are you still standing there? Why don't you take the young master over there?" After the young man left, the official breathed a sigh of relief and sat back down. Next, he shouted loudly, and when he heard someone coming in from outside the door, he asked again, "Name?" "Tang Ning." The official paused, looked up at him, and asked, "What's your name?" "Tang Ning." "Place of origin?" "Lingzhou, Neian County." The official from the Ministry of Etiquette took a book, flipped through it, nodded and said, "Go next door to get your test papers." The figure turned and walked out of the room, but the official did not call the next person in, but waved to a servant behind him again. When Tang Ning walked out of the etiquette department, the number of people queuing outside the yamen not only did not decrease, but actually increased. I don't know how many people took part in the provincial examination this time, but I think it's not 10,000, but about 7,000 or 8,000. Moreover, these people are all outstanding students who have been screened by various state examinations. If you want to select from these thousands of people, you can imagine how difficult it is to stand out and come out on top. He didn't feel anything before, but when he saw her today, he felt a little bit of urgency. There are still nearly 2 months before the provincial exam. During this period, he still needs to practice his essays. Unfortunately, Xiaoai is in Lingzhou and no one can correct his essays. Today is the second day after he arrived in the capital. This trip was much smoother than he expected. They traveled slowly and smoothly along the way. They didn't encounter any thieves or bandits, nor did they encounter any troubles. It only took about 10 days to get from Lingzhou to the capital. This made him regret it. If he had known earlier, he could have set off half a month or a month later and still caught up. However, since he was here, he would make the best of it. During this period, he would check and make up for the gaps. The old beggar tempted him several times along the way, saying that he wanted to take him to see the tender girls in the capital. He thought about it and still refused reluctantly. As a married man, he couldn't mess around outside without telling his wife, not to mention that he couldn't just leave his first time in his 2 lives in such a place so carelessly. The inn was in front of him. He stepped into the door and a figure stepped out. Caught off guard, Tang Ning bumped into the figure. Tang Ning only took a few steps back, but the man took several steps back and almost fell. After Tang Ning stabilized himself, he looked at the young woman and asked hurriedly, "Girl, are you okay?" The woman frowned, looked at him, and said, "I think my ankle is sprained." Tang Ning looked at her with some suspicion. He saw clearly just now that she just took a few steps back normally, without any signs of spraining her ankle. Is she trying to extort money? Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Can you still walk?" The woman tried to move her feet and shook her head, "No." It turned out to be an extortion. Tang Ning didn't expect that in the capital, under the feet of the emperor, there would be such a discordant thing. The woman looked extraordinary and beautiful. How could she learn to scam people? He looked at the woman and asked tentatively, "How about I take you to see a doctor?" The woman shook her head and said, "No, I'll live here. How about you help me upstairs to rest for a while?" Tang Ning understood that this was not scamming people, but a trap. If he helped the woman into the room, I believe that several burly men would rush in the next moment, saying that he bullied their sister and would report to the police if he didn't have a few hundred taels of silver. Maybe they have colluded with the government. He is a foreigner, so he is at their mercy. Fortunately, he has seen through their routine. His face changed, and suddenly pointed at the woman's feet, and said in surprise, "Girl, there is a snake under your feet." Ah! The woman's face turned pale, and her body moved sideways almost instantly, leaving Tang Ning dumbfounded. He silently took 2 steps back and stood beside Peng Chen. Judging from her reaction just now, he couldn't beat this woman. This also proved that she couldn't have sprained her ankle just now. The collision was most likely intentional. The woman looked at the ground, stunned for a moment, glared at Tang Ning, and asked, "Are you lying to me?" Didn't the girl sprain her ankle? Tang Ning looked at her, sighed, shook his head and said, "You are a beautiful woman, but you followed the thief. Girl, this is a road of no return, turn back." After that, he didn't look at the woman again, and went upstairs with Peng Chen. The woman turned around and watched their backs disappear. The anger on her face was instantly replaced by a smile. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 122. Tang Ning walked upstairs. Before returning to her room, she looked down and saw that the woman just now had left. Unexpectedly, as the capital of the Chen Kingdom, the social atmosphere of the capital city was not as good as that of Lingzhou. The Penkai immortal dance was so blatant, which instantly lowered his impression of the capital city. Although the woman was quite beautiful, he couldn't remember which philosopher said that the more beautiful a woman is, the more likely she is to lie. Love, luck and so on are all made up by YY novels. How can it be so easy to encounter? If the old beggar calculated his love luck so accurately, why didn't he figure out that he was tricked by him? Speaking of the old beggar, although he is a bit cunning in business, he is very honest and trustworthy in life. All he cared about was fine wine, and he never asked where the wine came from, and he didn't care what method Tang Ning used. He acted like a master, and it was really unpredictable. Peng Chen and the old beggar were in the rooms on his left and right respectively. Tang Ning returned to the room and lay on the bed. Thinking of the woman just now, she thought that although the social atmosphere in the capital was not very good, the girl was really as beautiful as the old beggar said. Even a porcelain woman looks so beautiful. No wonder before leaving, Tang Yaoyao told him not to get involved with women in the capital. The capital was so prosperous, there were temptations everywhere, and the environment was like this. If he didn't have the determination like him, it would be easy to get addicted to it and delay his studies. Tang Mansion. A figure walked quickly from the front, and the 2 concierges immediately bowed and said, "The lady is back." The woman waved to them and strode into the house. A voice came from behind her. "Where did Shui'er go so early in the morning?" The woman turned around, looked at the middle-aged man who walked slowly into the house, and said with a smile, "Second uncle is back. I just have nothing to do, so I went out for a walk." The middle-aged man looked at her and said, "You are a girl. If you are bored, you might as well work as a female celebrity at home instead of running around outside all the time." "Second uncle, I understand." The girl nodded obediently and left quickly. The middle-aged man watched her leave, shook his head, walked into another courtyard, and entered the side hall. He looked at a figure standing in front of the window and asked, "Is he really here?" Tang Hui stood in front of the window with his hands behind his back, nodded and said, "I went to the Ministry of Rights to get the test quotation this morning." Tang Chi thought for a while and said, "In the past 10 years or so, only 1 jade belt has been awarded as a reward for the local and state trials." His Majesty's thoughts are elusive, and it is better to be still than to move. Tang Hui breathed a long sigh of relief and said, I'm just afraid that someone doesn't want us to be quiet. Tang Chi shook his head and sighed, if Xiao hadn't acted willfully back then, how could what happened today be possible? Tang Hui waved his hand and said, don't mention the past anymore. You don't need to interfere in this matter. No one will care about an ordinary candidate. As long as he doesn't win the first place, he will leave the capital sooner or later. There was a strange look in Tang Chi's eyes, and he said, if he can really win the top prize, things will be easier to handle. Although the Tang family didn't want others in the capital to know about the scandal, if he could win the first prize, it wouldn't be a scandal and could even turn into a good thing. Of course, Tang Chi knew in his heart that this possibility was very slim. Those who can participate in the provincial examination are all outstanding talents selected from various states and governments. How difficult is it to stand out from these people and win the first place? What's more, there are outstanding people in the capital. Those children of big families have been taught by famous teachers since they were young, and have rich cultural heritage. How can they be compared to those students who come from small places? Tang Hui did not continue his topic, turned to look at him and said, these days, you still need to be careful of those who are interested and don't give them opportunities. Tang Chi nodded and said, I understand. The two chatted secretly in the room for a while. Tang Chi walked out of the yard, and a young man walked over to him and asked in a low voice, Dad, I heard from Mother that that scoundrel has come to the capital. Shut up, Tang Chi glanced at him and said, this is not something you can talk about. The provincial exam is coming soon, so why don't you study hard to avoid embarrassment to the Tang family? When the young man heard this, he retracted his head and said hurriedly, Dad, please hurry up, I have something else to do. While the young man fled in a hurry, in another part of the Tang mansion, the young woman returned to her courtyard, closed the courtyard door, walked to the base of a certain wall, skillfully climbed up the courtyard wall, jumped into the yard next door, and landed steadily. A soft voice sounded in the courtyard, next time you come here, just go through the main entrance. What if you fall and get bumped? It's okay. If you can fall like this, wouldn't it be a waste of time to learn martial arts? The woman looked at the figure standing in the courtyard, walked over quickly, and whispered, Sister-in-law, I just saw him. The figure trembled slightly, and his voice was a little panicked, he is here. The woman nodded and said, I have greeted all the inns in the capital in advance. As long as he comes to the capital, I will know immediately. She raised her head, looked at her and said, his eyes are very similar to my sister-in-law's. Opposite her, the young woman's face showed deep worry, and she murmured, he shouldn't have come to the capital. The woman looked at her, thought for a moment and asked, Sister-in-law, do you want to go see him? The young woman shook her head violently, no, this will hurt him. I can't see him. The woman held her hand and said, don't worry, sister-in-law, I won't let anyone hurt him. You stay at home and don't go anywhere. As soon as the woman finished speaking, a voice came from the door. Dad, why are you? The girl just started to speak, but was interrupted by a wave of hands coming in. Tang Jing looked at her and said, you don't know anything, and don't tell him anything. Let him finish the provincial examination with peace of mind, or fail the exam and return to his hometown, or pass the imperial examination, and wait for the imperial court to send him. You can help him, it's hurting him. The woman frowned and defended, but my sister-in-law. I'm fine. The young woman smiled and said, as long as he is fine, it doesn't matter if he passes or fails the exam, as long as he is safe. Tang Jing looked away, paused, and then continued, if he can pass the provincial examination, and be selected as the number one scholar in the palace examination by His Majesty, things may turn around. After he finished speaking, he looked at the young woman and said, before this, you are not allowed to do anything. If you don't do it, don't do it, the woman glared at him, turned around and left angrily. Tang Jing looked at the woman in the courtyard, sighed, and said, I've suffered a lot from you these past years. The young woman looked in a certain direction and said with a smile, as long as he is safe, everything is fine with me. Although she was smiling, there were 2 traces of tears on her face. At the door of the Tang mansion, a young man strode out, curled his lips and said, Why do you want to disgrace the Tang family? It's that scoundrel who disgraced the Tang family, not me. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 123. A few months ago, Fang Xiaopeng's uncle had said that he would go to Fang Mansion to inform him when he arrived in the capital. Fang Hong was the chief examiner of the Lingzhou provincial examination. It was unreasonable for him not to visit Fang Mansion after he arrived in the capital. In addition, Li Tianlan should also be informed, but he did not know where the Chu envoy was staying for the time being, and he had just arrived in the capital and went to visit the Chu envoy. If he was noticed by someone with ulterior motives, it would be a bit bad. Tang Ning of Fang Mansion planned to wait until after the Lantern Festival before going. As for Li Tianlan, he would put it aside for the time being. Before leaving, Tang Yejing's loyal advice was still echoing in his ears. Who knew if she had any eyes and ears in the capital? Going to see Li Tianlan, the thorn in her side, the next day after arriving in Beijing would be much more serious than being a playboy. Tang Ning shook his head secretly. Xiaoi, the wife, didn't say anything. Xiaoru, who was half a wife, didn't say that she was not allowed to know any messy women. She was just a neighbor, it was too much for her to be nosy. He gave the last jar of wine he had steamed on the road to the old beggar, walked out of the room, and walked downstairs. They arrived in Beijing very late yesterday, and just found an inn and paid for a day's accommodation. The environment here is not bad, he plans to stay for another half a month. At the counter downstairs, the waiter looked at him and said, Sir, I'm so sorry, you only booked 1 day last night, and you didn't come to say hello in the morning. Those rooms have been reserved just now. Although it was a bit troublesome to move things, it was indeed his negligence. Tang Ning thought about it and said, then change to another room. The waiter looked at him, shook his head again and said, Sorry, sir, our store is full today. This inn was full, so they had to find another place. Fortunately, the old beggar's entire luggage was a wine gourd. Peng Chen only had a few changes of clothes besides his knife. Tang Ning didn't have much stuff of his own, so he quickly packed up, checked out of the room, and walked out of the inn. Jingxi is the capital, with a huge flow of people. People from all over the world gather here, so there are naturally many inns for people to stay overnight. It didn't take long before he saw another one. Peng Chen walked in, walked out after a moment, shook his head, and said, It's full. Shangyuan is the most lively festival of the year, and it is also the year of the imperial examination. Students from all over the country gather in the capital, and it is common for inns to be tight. But they walked through several streets and all the inns were full, which was a bit unusual. Especially seeing with their own eyes that an inn that just told them that it was full had several guests staying in it in a short period of time. The old beggar held the wine gourd, took a sip of wine, smacked his lips and said, Did you offend someone? Tang Ning looked at the bustling crowd on the street and whispered, So soon? Peng Chen looked at him, his face darkened, and said, I'll go ask them. No need. Tang Ning waved his hand and said, Let's go somewhere else. After that, he turned around and went back. Peng Chen followed him with his bag on his back. The old beggar stuffed the wine gourd back, looked back in a certain direction, and then followed leisurely. At the end of his sight, In a private room of a restaurant, a young man withdrew his sight from the window. He glanced at the street below, then at the young man who was drinking in the private room, and asked, "Second young master, has that man offended you?" The young man held a pretty woman in his left hand, drank a glass of wine, leaned over and kissed the woman, passed the wine in his mouth to her, and saw a blush on the woman's face. Then he picked up the wine glass again and said, "You don't have to worry about this. In short, don't let him stay in the capital comfortably." The young man thought for a while, looked at him and asked, "What does the second young master mean?" The young man's hand wandered over the woman's body, and said lightly, "Be careful and don't cause any deaths." The young man smiled and said, "I understand." The streets of the capital. The old beggar looked up at the plaque of a luxurious attic, then looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Are you sure we want to live here?" Looking at the three large gilded characters Hongxiu Pavilion on the plaque, Tang Ning was also a little unexpected. He knew that the Tang family also had businesses in the capital, but he didn't expect that the rich man Tang, who looked thick-browed and big-eyed, was actually doing brothel business in the capital. He was sure that Tang Yaoyao didn't know about this, otherwise she wouldn't have given him such a sign and reminded him not to mess around with other girls outside. Or did she mean that he shouldn't mess around with other girls outside, and the girls in their brothel could have in-depth exchanges at will? In any case, they walked on the streets of the capital for several hours and only saw this place with a clear mark of the Tang family. Tang Ning shook his head and said, "Let's go in and take a look." When he stepped into this attic and looked inside, for a moment, he felt like he had stepped into another world. There was a pleasant sound of stringed instruments surrounding his ears. On a high platform in the middle of the lobby, several women with enchanting figures were dancing to the music. Every movement was in line with the rhythm of the music. At first glance, it gave people an extreme sense of beauty. They were all wearing very thin clothes, and their snow-white skin was faintly visible under the gauze-like clothes, sometimes revealing their belly buttons, or a small section of smooth skin. Gudong. Tang Ning noticed that Peng Chen swallowed softly and bent his body slightly. The old beggar threw the wine gourd behind him and took it from his crotch in a very graceless manner. He turned to look at Tang Ning and said seriously, "Let's live here." There were not many guests in the loft. Apart from the dancers above, there were only about a dozen of them. Judging from their clothing, they were all either rich or noble. Compared with them, Tang Ning and the other three, especially the old beggar, seemed a little too different. A man who looked like a shopkeeper walked over from inside, looked at the three of them in surprise, and finally landed on Tang Ning. He smiled and said, "Sir, please show me the jade sign." Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Jade plaque?" The shopkeeper nodded and said, "Only those with the jade token given by this pavilion can enter this pavilion." He looked at Tang Ning and others and said politely, "This pavilion is neither a brothel nor an inn. If you want to stay in a hotel or have fun, please go out and turn left." Tang Ning raised her head and looked at the sign on a pillar in the attic again. She took out a wooden sign from her arms and said, "I don't have a jade sign. Can a wooden sign be okay? The logo here is the same as the one on the sign Tang Yaji gave him, but what he wants is a jade sign. Is the sign in his hand useful?" The shopkeeper looked at the wooden sign in his hand, his body trembled, and he immediately asked, "Sir, can I show the sign to the villain?" Tang Ning handed him the wooden sign casually. The shopkeeper took the wooden sign, looked at it over and over for a while, then handed it to him and said, "Sir, wait a moment, I'll be back soon." He trotted around the high platform and ran to the rear. He quickly ran out again, took the wooden sign from Tang Ning's hand again, and matched it with the other one in his hand. The patterns on the edges of the two wooden plaques fit perfectly together, and together they are exactly the same as the patterns on the pillars in the pavilion. The shopkeeper handed the wooden sign to Tang Ning, bowed and said respectfully, "I wonder what your orders are, master." It's not like there was any order. Tang Ning glanced at him in surprise, shook her head and said, "Do you have a place to stay here?" The shopkeeper nodded without any hesitation and said respectfully, "Sir, please follow me." He led Tang Ning and the three of them to the high platform, and Tang Ning discovered that the high platform extended from the stairs in the middle. There were steps on both sides that could go up to the second floor. "Master, please follow me upstairs." When Tang Ning and he walked upstairs, as soon as they stepped onto the steps, a voice came from behind them. "Stop!" A young man stepped forward, looked at the shopkeeper, and asked, "Don't you allow guests to go up to the second floor of your Hongzhou pavilion? What does this mean?" The shopkeeper looked at him and explained, "Young master, this young master is a distinguished guest of our Red Sleeve pavilion." Dignified guest. The young man was startled when he heard this, and then said angrily, "He is your honored guest, but I am not your honored guest." Without waiting for the shopkeeper's answer, he strode up the steps, pointed at the woman dancing on the stage, and said angrily, "You said that the second floor is the girls' boudoir and no outsiders are allowed to enter. It turns out that they are just fooling people. You dare to fool me. Let me tell you, not only do I want to go up there today, but I also want them to accompany me. One is not enough, I want 10. Ha ha." As soon as he finished speaking, a laugh came to his ears. The young man turned around suddenly, pointed at the old beggar, and said angrily, "Why are you laughing?" The old beggar looked at him with a look of ridicule on his face and said, "How can you pretend to be an expert in flowers when you are just a little boy?" The young man was startled, and his face instantly turned blood red. He pointed at him and said in a trembling voice, You don't want to spit on others. I can tell from your face that your kidneys are not good." The old beggar looked at him, shook his head, and asked, "Young man, can't you get up in the morning?" The young man's body trembled, and his face turned from red to white and then to red. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 124. Tang Ning realized that she had misunderstood Mr. Tang. Although the name Hongzhou Pavilion sounds a bit like a brothel, it is actually not a brothel, at least not on the surface. The guests downstairs were dressed luxuriously and looked very elegant. They were just listening to the music and watching the dances. There was no erotic atmosphere at all, but elegance was everywhere. This made Tang Ning more and more curious. The rich man Tang who opened a high-end club was more surprising than the rich man Tang who opened a brothel. A spacious and luxurious room upstairs. The manager of Hongzhou Pavilion looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Do you have any other orders, master?" "No more." Tang Ning shook her head, feeling a little strange about the shopkeeper's overly respectful attitude. After thinking about it, she asked, "Is there anything wrong with the guy downstairs?" The shopkeeper bowed and said, "Don't worry, young master, I will handle it well." Tang Ning looked at him and couldn't help being surprised. He had just met the young man downstairs who couldn't get up just this morning. When he was receiving the examination certificate at the Yamen of the Ministry of Rights, he was in front of him. The official of the Ministry of Rights treated him with great respect. It was obvious that he had a good status. Being called young master means that he should be a child of a prince's family, but the fat shopkeeper doesn't seem to care about it at all. Tang Ning didn't know whether he overestimated the young master's background or underestimated the manager of the Red Sleeve Pavilion. The shopkeeper bowed to him and said, "If the young master has no other instructions, I will leave first." Tang Ning walked to the door with him and saw the old beggar leaning against the wall, looking at several women not far away with curious eyes, and occasionally picking up his crotch, looking extremely obscene. The shopkeeper of Hongzhou Pavilion bowed his hands to him and said, "Young master, if you have any requests, you can give them at any time." "Any request?" The old beggar's eyes lit up, he pointed at a few women not far away, looked at him and said, "Let them come and dance in my room." Tang Ning secretly cursed the old man for being dishonest. She waved her hand to the shopkeeper and said, "It's okay. You can go about your business." The old beggar watched with regret as the women returned to their respective rooms, looked around again, and said, "This place is nice. Your little sweetheart treats you very well. What kind of little lover is this? That long-legged girl. When did Fairy Tang become his sweetheart?" The crooked old guy was always slanderous. Tang Ning glanced at him and said, "Go back to your room and tidy up. We'll go down for dinner later." When he came up just now, he saw that wine and food were provided here. Downstairs, the young man sat back down and saw the eyes of the people around him glancing at him intentionally or unintentionally. There seemed to be a smile on his face. He slammed the table, stood up, looked around, and said angrily, "Look. What are you looking at? If you look at it again, I'll dig out your eyes." After cursing like this, seeing everyone looking away and not daring to look again, he sat down again and glanced upward, his expression a little depressed, but also vaguely expectant. When Tang Ning and the old beggar Peng Chen came down from upstairs and found a table to sit down, the young man immediately came over. Although he was still angry at the old guy for exposing his scar just now, his hidden disease had never been told to any outsiders, and even the imperial doctor could not diagnose it. However, he could see it at a glance, which was enough to prove that this person was extraordinary. He looked at the old beggar and whispered, "Old man, what you just said, is there anything you can do?" "Of course there is a way." The old beggar looked at him and said, "It's just that I helped you. What benefits can you give me?" The young man's eyes lit up and he immediately asked, "What benefits does the old man want?" This was to admit that what the old beggar had just said was right. Tang Ning couldn't help but take a second look at the young man. People can't be judged by appearance, and sea water cannot be measured. This young man looks handsome and has extraordinary bearing. But who would have thought that he is actually a silver man? "Why can't you get up in the morning?" "I'm old and can't remember something." The old beggar thought for a while and said, "If you have any fine wines at home, bring them here. Maybe after I drank them, I suddenly remembered them when I was happy." Excessive drinking not only damages the liver, but also damages the kidneys. Tang Ning felt that the old beggar's kidneys would not be much better. He kept talking about the girls from the capital who were beautiful all day long. He was probably just trying to satisfy his cravings. He had no money and nothing. In terms of appearance, if you enter a brothel and don't get beaten up, you still want to sleep with a girl and dream. The young man thought for a moment, looked at him, and said, "Old man, wait here. I'll go back and get the wine and I'll be here right away." The old beggar waved his hand and said, "No hurry, just remember to deliver it in the next 2 days." After speaking, he looked at Tang Ning and said, "Teach him the secret to strengthening your kidneys." After the young man was stunned for a moment, he looked at Tang Ning, as if he had met a close friend, and said in surprise, "Could it be that my brother is also?" "I'm not." The young man looked at him with a smile on his face and said, I understand. I really am not." The young man frowned and said, "We are both from the end of the world, but it's boring for my brother to be so secretive." The old beggar waved his hand and said, Okay, you two little chickens, please stop being humble to each other." The young man looked at Tang Ning with an expression on his face. He sat next to Tang Ning and asked, "Don't you know your brother's name?" "A virgin is a virgin, and being a virgin is not something to be ashamed of. He and this young master are completely different. Why is he looking like he has met a confidant?" The more he talked, the more confusing it became. Tang Ning didn't want to continue the question with him, so he said calmly, "Tang Ning. My name is Xiaoju." The young man introduced himself and said to him, "Brother Tang, what secret book?" Tang Ning shook his head and said, "I don't have it with me." "It doesn't matter, just go back and get it." The young man named Xiaoju looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Where is Brother Tang's home?" "Lingzhou." Tang Ning only kept the secret book for future use. After all, he just couldn't use his kidney for the time being, unlike this young master. He thought for a moment and said, I remember there is a prescription in it. I will write it down later. You can try it first. When the provincial exam is over, you can send someone to Lingzhou to get the secret book. Although they are different in nature, he can understand his feelings. Being looked at with such strange eyes, the bitterness, can only be understood by those who have experienced it personally. Okay, Xiaoju nodded and said, today's meal is on my behalf. The shopkeeper of Hongxiu Pavilion stood aside and said, young master, today's meal is on my behalf. Just consider it as an apology to you. Xiaoju slapped the table, glared at him, and said, I said I will treat you, so are you not giving me face? The shopkeeper could only take 2 steps back and said helplessly, then listen to you, young master. This was the first time Tang Ning had seen someone like Xiaoju. Could he be the legendary dandy in the capital? Xiaoju picked up the chopsticks and looked at Tang Ning again, asking, the second floor of Hongxiu Pavilion is never open to outsiders. How can you go up there? Hongxiu Pavilion is very famous in the capital. The shopkeeper behind the scenes has a deep background and is extremely mysterious. Even he is a little wary. Naturally, he is very curious about people who can break the rules of the pavilion. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, because I know their shopkeeper. Hongxiu Pavilion is the property of the Tang family. Mr. Tang and his father-in-law have been in a relationship for more than 10 years. Zhongyi and Tang Yajing are as close as sisters. He and Tang Yaoyao are also close friends. They can be regarded as half-in-laws, so they are naturally treated differently from outsiders like them. Xiaoju glanced at the shopkeeper not far away, and said, from now on, we are friends. If you encounter anything in the capital, just report my name. Tang Ning nodded politely, eating while enjoying the dance on the stage. The women danced gracefully and their movements were seductive. Although they were not particularly revealing, they exuded a different kind of charm from head to toe, stirring people's heartstrings all the time. This made him feel a little hot, so he put down his chopsticks, reached under the table with one hand, and straightened his robe. Xiaoju looked at him, then looked down at himself, a hint of joy appeared on his face, and whispered, it really works. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 125. The capital was indeed different from Lingzhou. Tang Ning had never seen such a charming dance in Lingzhou. A young virgin like Peng Chen, who had never seen much of the world, had already reached under the table several times before finishing the meal. Looking at the young master, he didn't show any ugly expression from beginning to end, and his hands were placed on the table. He was worthy of being a dandy from the capital who had seen the world. This kind of determination was hard for Tang Ning to match. After eating, Tang Ning wrote down the prescription recorded in the secret book and gave it to him. After Xiaoju hurriedly thanked her, she couldn't wait to take it back and try it out. Tang Ning went back to her room to rest for a while, then walked downstairs again and walked to the counter. When the shopkeeper saw him coming, he immediately walked out and said respectfully, what are your orders, master? Shopkeeper Su, you don't have to be so polite. Tang Ning looked at him and asked casually, how long has Shopkeeper Su been in the capital? Shopkeeper Su smiled and said, to be fair to you, I am born and raised in the capital, and it has been more than 30 years now. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, there is something that I don't know is convenient for Shopkeeper Su. Shopkeeper Su immediately said, young master is a distinguished guest. If you have any instructions, it doesn't matter. It's not an order. Tang Ning shook her head and said, I want Shopkeeper Su to help me inquire about something. After a while, Shopkeeper Su nodded, waved to a waiter in the pavilion, and said, let's put down what we are doing and go check on something. The guy walked out in a hurry. Shopkeeper Su looked at Tang Ning again and said, "Master, wait a moment, he will be back soon." Tang Ning found a seat downstairs and sat down. She looked up and saw that the gauze curtain on the high platform had been lowered. There was a vague figure inside, and the melodious music of Qing Yuan came from the gauze curtain. "Sir, please have some tea." A fragrant breeze blew past him, and a young woman filled the tea for him, smiled slightly, and left gracefully. "Thank you." Tang Ning looked at her and nodded slightly, then took a sip of tea, the fragrance lingering on her teeth and cheeks, refreshing. The sound of music is heard and the fragrance of tea is refreshing, giving people full enjoyment. In the bustling and noisy capital, it is quite rare to find such a quiet place. The old beggar was right, this is indeed a good place. Before Tang Ning finished her cup of tea, the guy who had just gone out came back. Shopkeeper Su walked over with him. The waiter looked at Tang Ning and said, "Young Master Lu Li from the Ministry of Rights, he secretly sent people to go down to those inns." Minister of Rights, Minister of Rights. Tang Ning thought for a moment, looked at Shopkeeper Su, and asked, "Does Shopkeeper Su know about the Tang family in the capital?" Shopkeeper Su nodded and said, "The Tang family held a high position in the capital and was very prominent. The head of the family, Tang Hui, was the Minister of Rights of the dynasty. His two brothers, one was a member of the Dongta family at that time, and the other was a member of the Zongsha family. They are all close ministers of the emperor, and a legitimate daughter of the Tang family is the very favored concubine Tang Hui in the palace, the biological mother of Prince Duan." Another steward of the Tang family once told him these words, and that was all he said. However, Shopkeeper Su did not pause and continued to speak. "The youngest daughter of the Tang family, 20 years ago, due to dissatisfaction with he was married to a wealthy family in the capital and escaped from the capital privately. He was found by the Tang family 2 years later. Since then, he has not stepped out of the Tang family." Tang Ning was silent for a long time before asking, "Do you know where the Tang family's legitimate daughter was brought back from?" Shopkeeper Su glanced at him and said, "There's no way to know." Tang Ning smiled, bowed her hands to him, and said, "Thank you so much, Shopkeeper Su." Shopkeeper Su had a look of doubt on his face, but he didn't ask any more questions and said in return, "You're welcome, sir." Watching Tang Ning walk upstairs, several young women came over, glanced in the direction upstairs, and asked in a low voice, "Shopkeeper, who is this young Master Tang? Is he the son of the big shopkeeper? I haven't heard of the big shopkeeper. The shopkeeper has a son?" "Don't talk too much if you shouldn't ask." Shopkeeper Su glared at her and said, "Why are you still standing there? Get ready, it's your turn." The women dispersed in a hurry. Shopkeeper Su looked at the direction upstairs, touched his chin, and murmured to himself, "She's from Lingzhou, the shopkeeper has only one daughter, is she my uncle?" In the Red Sleeve Pavilion, when Shopkeeper Su was doubtful, a young woman grabbed the innkeeper's collar at an inn in the capital and said angrily, "Checked out and left?" She checked out and left after just 1 day, saying, Where did you go?" The guy was lifted up by her collar, his face turned pale with fright, and he trembled, Girl, they checked out before noon, I really don't know where they went." After a while, the young woman strode out of the inn and stood on the street, looking at the bustling crowds on the street. A slightly worried look appeared on her face. After a long time, she took steps towards another inn ahead. At the same time, in a brothel somewhere in the middle of Beijing, a young man lifted up his pants, looked at the servants in the room, and said angrily, "Lost you? If you can lose yourself with someone, what are you going to do for food?" A servant hurriedly explained, "Master, it's really busy in Beijing these days, there are too many people on the streets." The young man threw a pillow over and said angrily, "Look for it in one inn after another. It's night, Dingguo Duke's mansion." Xiaoju looked at the bowl of dark medicinal juice in front of him, looked at an old man beside him, and asked, "Do you see anything?" Is there anything wrong with this medicine? The old man looked at the prescription in his hand for a long time, shook his head, and said, "Young master, there is nothing wrong with this prescription. Although I have never seen it, it looks like an ordinary tonic." Xiaoju asked uncertainly, "Is it not poisonous?" The old man shook his head and said, "No." "Are you sure?" "I guarantee it with my character." "Okay, okay, you go down." Xiaoju waved his hand, picked up the jade bowl with one hand, put it to his mouth, hesitated for a moment, pointed to a servant at the door, and said, "Xiaofu, come here." The servant immediately trotted over and asked, "Young master, what do you want?" Xiaoju handed him the jade bowl in his hand and said, "Drink a sip." Xiaofu looked at the dark brown medicine juice with a pungent smell in Xiaoju's hand, his face changed, and he trembled, "Young master, this." Pa! Xiaoju reached into his arms and slapped a silver note on the table. A glimmer of light flashed in Xiaofu's eyes, but he was still a little hesitant, and said in embarrassment, "Young master, what is this?" Pa! Xiaoju slapped a silver note on the table again. A trace of determination appeared on Xiaofu's face, and he said with a bow, "I am willing to die for the young master." Xiaoju slapped him on the head and said, "I won't let you die. This medicine is very tonic. Try it." Xiaofu looked at him again, thinking that although the young master was a playboy, he would not joke with human life. These 200 taels of silver were enough for him to marry Qiwa next door. "Young master, if I have something to do, please help me take care of my blind mother and my wife who has not yet married." He showed a sad look on his face, picked up the jade bowl, and drank it all. Xiaoju slapped him on the head again and said angrily, "Leave some for me, what should I drink after you finish drinking?" Xiaofu hurriedly said, "Sorry, young master, I forgot." Xiaoju waved his hand, looked at him and asked, "How is it, how do you feel?" Xiaofu's face was wrinkled, and he said, "Bitter." "What else?" "No more." "No more." Xiaoju looked him up and down and said, "Wait a little longer." He moved his shoulders and said, "Come and help me massage my shoulders." Xiaofu ran behind him nervously, put his hands on his shoulders and pressed gently. Xiaoju closed his eyes, and after a moment, he asked again, "Still don't feel anything?" Xiaofu shook his head, "No." "Keep pressing." "Okay." "Stop." At a certain moment, Xiaoju suddenly opened his eyes, frowned and asked, "What did you use to poke me?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 126. Red Sleeve Pavilion. The old beggar was sitting at the table in the corner of the first floor. While eating lunch, he asked Peng Chen, "Has he been sleeping since yesterday afternoon?" Peng Chen put down his chopsticks, wiped his mouth, and nodded. The old beggar wondered, he couldn't have called a few girls last night. It's impossible. There was no sound in the room. After sleeping for an unknown number of hours, Tang Ning felt refreshed and refreshed. She walked downstairs and sat down to eat under the gazes of the old beggar and Peng Chen. He took a sip of tea to moisten his throat, looked at them, and asked, "What are you looking at me for?" The old beggar looked at him and asked, "Don't you know how many hours you have slept?" Tang Ning looked outside, shook her head and said, "It won't be long, isn't it still dark?" The old beggar looked at the sky outside and reminded, "It's already noon the next day." "Really?" Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "Today is the Lantern Festival. There will be a lantern festival and fireworks. Do you want to go out for a walk tonight?" As soon as he finished speaking, a figure rushed in from outside. "You haven't eaten yet?" Xiaoju looked at Tang Ning. After being stunned for a moment, He pulled him up and said, "Let's go to the capital. Why don't we go to Tiananmen for a meal? I'll treat you today. If you want to eat, whatever." Tang Ning was pulled out of the door by him. Xiao Ju's face looked a little excited as he said, "When our illnesses are cured, I will take you to sleep in brothels all over the capital and make up for what I owe you over the past 10 years. Wait, wait." Tang Ning stopped and asked, "What do you mean, what's the disease?" Xiao Ju leaned into his ear and whispered. "Are you up?" Tang Ning was also surprised. Is the recipe recorded in the secret book really that powerful? Although it was only for a short while. Xiao Ju looked at him, tears flashing in his eyes, and said, "But it's already good." He took a deep breath, looked at Tang Ning, and said with some embarrassment, "I was a little excited and lost my temper. I believe Brother Tang can understand." I understand," Tang Ning nodded subconsciously, then shook her head violently, looked at him and asked, "What can you understand?" Although both of them are lifting people, he is not only lifting people, but also lifting people. Although this young master Xiao is lifting people, he is not lifting people. "Let's not talk about this anymore." Xiao Ju shook his head and said, "Brother Tang's kindness to Xiao has been rekindled. I hope you will show your respect for this meal. Forget about eating, but what he just said about sleeping in all the brothels in the capital, he has no interest in it at all. Helping others is a traditional virtue of the Chinese nation. Helping Mr. Xiao regain his self-confidence and restore his virility as a man is also a way of doing good deeds without expecting anything in return." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Brother Xiao, if you want to treat us, why not choose the Red Sleep Pavilion? It's the same thing." "That's not possible." Xiao Ju shook his head and said, "Come to Hongxiu Pavilion to listen to music and enjoy dancing. If you want to have a serious meal, you have to go to Tiananmen. After you finish eating, I will take you to Yakuai Tower, where you can choose any girl and tell me which one you like." This young master Xiao was really enthusiastic about his friends. He would eat, drink and take care of himself. Tang Ning was about to refuse when she saw a woman walking from the front and was slightly startled. Xiao Ju also looked over. After looking at it, he wondered, does Brother Tang not like promiscuous women and good families? We need to put more thought into this. We don't advocate things that corrupt morals. The woman walked over, looked at Tang Ning with a smile, and said, "Why didn't anyone come to notify me when we arrived in the capital?" Xiao Ju looked at the woman, then at Tang Ning, and asked in surprise, "Do you know her?" Tang Ning's face became even more confused. She looked at the woman whom she had never seen before but felt very familiar to her, and said in surprise, "Girl, we recognize." Before he finished speaking, his eyes swept across the woman's chest, and a flash of thunder flashed through his mind, and he said in surprise, "Miss Li." Among the women he knew, Li Tianlan was the only one of this size. I was used to seeing her disguised as a man, so seeing her transform into a woman for the first time was really a bit uncomfortable. Seeing the two people walking into the Red Sleep Pavilion, Xiao Ju froze on the spot and murmured, "No wonder you don't go to Yakuai Tower. It turns out that you already have a good girl in the capital." Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, "Why didn't you inform us in advance? If someone hadn't seen you coming in here yesterday, I would have thought that it would take some time for you to set off." "We have only been here 2 days." Tang Ning looked her over again and asked, "Why are you dressed like this?" Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, "I am a woman, why can't I dress like this?" "I mean, aren't you afraid of being seen by others?" Tang Ning looked at her and shook her head. "If someone found out, they might think that Mr. Li from Chu State has some kind of cross-dressing habit." Li Tianlan glanced at him and said, "How can I see you if I don't dress like this?" What she said was true, it would indeed be inappropriate for her to come to him as an envoy of Chu State. When he was in Lingzhou, there was another reason to accompany the envoy. In the capital, If a candidate who was about to take the provincial examination was too close to the Chu envoy, he would be suspected of having political leanings. It is impossible for a candidate with problematic political leanings to pass the Jinchi examination. How can he achieve happiness in life if he fails to pass the Jinchi examination? Although Miss Li likes men's clothing, Tang Yejing still needs to learn this casual care and consideration. The old beggar looked at Li Tianlan and said in surprise, "Hey, did the little girl have any adventures recently? Has her skill increased by more than 1 point?" Seeing a slightly wary look on Li Tianlan's face, Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Don't worry, the senior is one of our own." Li Tianlan's expression softened. He looked at Tang Ning and said, "Before coming to Chen State, I encountered a bottleneck in martial arts. I met those assassins that day and gained a little bit, plus your half of the pill." Tang Ning no longer wanted to hear about the half pill. When he talked about the great return pill, he couldn't help but look at Li Tianlan's lips, and then pursed his lips subconsciously. As soon as Li Tianlan finished speaking, he saw Tang Ning's subconscious actions and regretted mentioning the half pill. He changed the subject and said, "Why are you here?" "It's a long story." Tang Ning shook her head and asked, "When will you leave to return to Chu?" Li Tianlan frowned and looked at him, "You just expect me to leave?" Tang Ning didn't know how to describe a woman like Li Tianlan. When she was dressed as a man, she acted resolutely, regardless of her breasts. No one would have thought that she was a girl. When she changed back into women's clothing, her every move, every smile, and every move had a different style that belonged to a woman. What's even more amazing is that she could actually control these two different types very well. There is such a special person. My friend, this is really addictive. You misunderstood. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "I need your help with something. If you are still in the capital before the provincial examination, can you give me some advice?" Li Tianlan pondered for a moment, looked at him and asked, "Aren't you worried about me stealing my master?" Tang Ning just wanted to organize the 30 policy essays on topics and 30 years of imperial examination #1 scholars policy essays that were sold on the market in her own language, and then asked her to help find out what was wrong. It's not easy to steal a teacher. It's better to worry about her stealing a teacher than to worry about her stealing a person. Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Young scholar is so humble. If you want to steal, I will steal from you. With your guidance, I will be more confident in this provincial examination." He has not forgotten that Miss Li was the last #1 scholar in Chu State. Even if she has a strong background, she can't do it without 2 brushes. What's more, when they were in Lingzhou, they had a lot of exchanges. No matter how humble she was, Tang Ning still knew her. The depth. Li Tianlan didn't hesitate for long before he nodded and said, "Okay." Tang Ning nodded, "Then it's settled. The #1 scholar will serve as an accompaniment. Other candidates do not have this kind of treatment. I wonder if she has any unique experience in the imperial examination." Taking advantage of the fact that there is still more than a month left before the provincial examination, I want to have an in-depth discussion with her. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 127. Tang Ning himself did not expect that he would sleep until the next day. The 13th and 14th of the first lunar month, plus the Lantern Festival on the 15th of the first lunar month, are the most lively days of the year in the capital. There is no curfew in the city during these 3 days, and the people can enjoy the rich nightlife. They arrived in the capital 2 days ago and planned to go for a good stroll at night, but they did not expect to sleep until the Lantern Festival. If they missed tonight, they would have to wait until next year. The sky had just darkened, and the whole capital gradually lit up again, with lights as bright as day. The Lantern Festival in the capital, in terms of liveliness and prosperity, naturally cannot be compared with those modern metropolises in later generations, but the candle-light swaying lanterns hanging on the streets, the lotus lanterns floating in the river, and the floating pleasure boats are more charming than the colorful neon lights in later generations, which block the streets during festivals. Xiaoju followed the old beggar, serving him carefully like a servant, without any airs of a young master. He was ineffective even after taking aphrodisiacs, but he only responded to that one prescription. The old beggar had become his life-saving straw for achieving sexual happiness. Tang Ning and Li Tianlan walked in front. When they reached a bridge, Li Tianlan stopped and looked into the distance. Tang Ning turned his head to look at her, noticing a melancholy expression on her face. After thinking for a while, he asked, being a stranger in a foreign land, far away from home and relatives during the Lantern Festival, you must feel bad, right? Li Tianlan looked down at the lotus lanterns floating below, then looked at him again and asked, aren't you the same? Tang Ning was stunned for a long time, and then looked at the same night sky as her, and murmured, I'll get used to it, it'll be fine. Li Tianlan looked at him and comforted him, the delegation will stay in the capital for a long time, you are better than me, you can go back to Lingzhou after the imperial examination. Tang Ning sighed and whispered, I can't go back. Li Tianlan turned his head to look at him, and fireworks bloomed in the night sky in the distance, clearly reflecting his profile. The same melancholy, the same longing, but the difference is the hidden despair. It seems that what he is thinking about is a place he can never go back to. He just left Lingzhou and came to the capital to take the exam. This trace of despair should never appear on his face. Li Tianlan stared at him blankly, his heart full of doubts. Thinking of another world, Tang Ning was absent-minded for a moment. When he came to his senses, he found that Li Tianlan was looking at him. Tang Ning was surprised and said, why are you looking at me, Miss Li? Nothing. Li Tianlan came back to his senses and immediately looked away, and said, we are familiar with each other. Don't call me Miss Li or Miss Li in the future. Tang Ning also felt that this was a bit strange. After all, everyone was so familiar with each other. What's more, Li Tianlan was his savior. What's strange about being with a savior? He thought for a moment and said, if I don't call you Miss Li, how about I call you Sister Lan? If you are younger than me, then I can call you Sister Lan, what do you think of Lan Lan? Li Tianlan pondered for a moment, looked at him and said, you should still call me Miss Li. Women are really fickle. She is the one who says she doesn't want to be called Miss Li, and she is also the one who says she wants to be called Miss Li. She wants it sometimes and doesn't want it sometimes. All the principles in the world are occupied by them. During this time, Xiaoju and the old beggar didn't know where they went. Tang Ning saw that Li Tianlan had also walked down the bridge, and hurriedly followed her. The old beggar and Peng Chen had already left. In order to prevent accidents, she had to hold Miss Li's thighs tightly. Under the bridge was a small stall for guessing lantern riddles. There were several rows of lanterns hanging on a long rack. 10 coins could be paid to approach and guess once. If the guess was correct, the lantern could be taken away. If the guess was wrong, the 10 coins would not be returned. To prevent people from picking out the right answers, the riddles were covered. When Tang Ning walked over, Li Tianlan had already revealed one riddle. The whole mountain is covered with lush greenery, and people are among the trees and grass. She took a look and said, it's the word tea. The stall owner walked over, smiled, took down the sky lantern, and said, congratulations, young lady, you guessed it right. A woman next to her pinched her male companion's waist and said angrily, you are useless. You didn't even guess it? You are not even as good as a woman. The young man smiled and said, it's just a little bit, just a little bit. Tang Ning took the lantern handed over by the shopkeeper, and Li Tianlan had already revealed another one. 99. 1 less makes 100, it's the word white. The stall owner's smile was no longer as bright as before. He took down the lantern and smiled, young lady is really smart. Li Tianlan continued to walk forward, Two mountains face each other and are connected, with a dangerous peak in the middle piercing the blue sky. It's the word you dot. The stall owner's smile began to become forced. You have it, he has it, everyone has it, but I don't. It's a human character. The stall owner couldn't laugh anymore. It's hard to say, it's a character. There are mountains on all sides, and the mountains are connected. It's a character. When Li Tianlan guessed more than 10 times in a row, Tang Ning couldn't laugh anymore, because he couldn't hold the lamp anymore. The stall owner walked up to him, stuffed a piece of silver in his hand, and whispered, "Sir, please take care of your wife. My family relies on this small business to make a living." Tang Ning explained, "She is not my wife." The stall owner looked at him and said, "Then why don't you leave quickly? If you are seen by acquaintances, you will be thrown into the pig cage. It's not someone else's wife either. Miss Thief, how dare you do this so blatantly? If you don't leave, I'll call for help." Tang Ning only picked two good-looking lanterns and pulled Li Tianlan away. He wasn't afraid of being thrown into a pig cage or being caught by Miss Thief, but she was just a small business, and if she messed it up like this, the whole family might go hungry. Li Tianlan glanced at the place where the lantern riddles were being guessed and said, "There is no business without fraud." Just now, he saw that the person he guessed was a child, so he wanted to deny his debt. What kind of business is such a person still doing? Why did you stop me? He stopped her because if she continued to guess, the stall owner would shout Miss Thief. Tang Ning was worried that if he shouted it out, he would not live to see the next lantern festival. He shook his head and said, "It's normal for ordinary people in the market." He bullied the child, so naturally there are people who bully him. Tang Ning looked back and saw that the crowd in front of the stall had dispersed. A child was standing in front of the lantern stand, and the stall owner was pinned to the ground and beaten by a strong man. "How dare you bully my son? I'll beat you to death." Walking around the street with Li Tianlan, I met Xiaoju and the old beggar again. "Where did you two go?" "I was just about to send someone to look for you." Xiaoju looked at the two suspiciously and said, "We've been walking around for half a night, we're tired and hungry, let's go to Tianrunju, I'll treat you, fill your stomach first and then go shopping." In order to celebrate his upcoming becoming a real Juren, Xiaoju insisted on treating him to a meal. Tang Ning couldn't refuse, and didn't want to dampen his enthusiasm, so he hesitated for a moment and agreed. Tang Ning originally thought that Tianrunju was a restaurant, but when he arrived, he found out that it was actually a large garden. In a place like the capital where every inch of land is worth a lot of money, the boss behind Tianrunju must be rich and powerful to be able to buy such a garden as a restaurant. Li Tianlan stopped at the door of Tianrunju and looked at the couplets hanging on both sides of the gate. Although it was night, the surrounding lights were bright, and the couplets were also clear. It's a cool and peaceful place to talk about poetry, especially when the lotus dew is fresh and the bamboo spring is just warm. To relieve the worries in my heart, what can I do with wine? I can chew the winter plums and eat the autumn chrysanthemums. Li Tianlan looked at the couplet and said, "This couplet is elegant. Can you think of another one besides this one?" Tang Ning knew that she was addicted to couplets again, so she urged her, "This couplet is ordinary. What's so good about it? Let's go in and eat first. If you want to make a couplet, you can go back in the evening and you have plenty of time to do it slowly. If you can't make it, then you can't make it. What do you mean by ordinary couplets? Since our couplets are ordinary, you can come up with an extraordinary one." Tang Ning just finished speaking when an unconvinced voice came from behind them. He turned his head and saw a girl dressed as a maid with her hands on her hips, puffing out her chest, looking at him angrily. The little girl is still imitating others to puff out her chest. Who gave her the courage to puff out her chest in front of Miss Li? Tang Ning didn't intend to argue with the maid, so he shook his head and said, "Go in." The maid stuck out her tongue at him and said, "You big talker, You're scared now, you're still a man. Tang Ning had already taken a step forward, but he took it back. The thing he hated most in his life was when someone doubted whether he was a real man, nothing else. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 128. Men can be called poor, ugly, and unmotivated, but they cannot be questioned as to whether they are men. Tang Ning looked at the little maid, smiled and asked, "Little girl, what did you just say?" The little maid took a few steps back and asked warily, "What do you want to do?" Li Tianlan looked at Tang Ning's serious look, tugged on his sleeves and said, "Forget it, let's go in first." Xiaoju took a step forward, shook his head, and said, "You women don't have to worry about men's affairs." At this moment, when he looked at Tang Ning, he seemed to see another version of himself. When you are in a cool and refreshing state of the world, it's a good time to talk about poetry. When the lotus dew is freshly cooked, and the bamboo spring is just beginning to heat up, when you are pouring out the sorrow in your chest, what's the right drink to drink with it? You can chew the cold plums carefully and feast on the autumn chrysanthemums. Tang Ning ignored the little maid and looked at the couplet at the door of Tianatianju. She said, "This couplet is full of elegance. It seems that people who come here are not just diners drinking and eating, but like literati singing in the wind and enjoying the moon, tasting plums and chrysanthemums. It's really elegant. I think the people who come here to eat here on weekdays are all elegant people." A charming woman behind the little maid looked at him, as if waiting for his next words. Tang Ning looked back from the couplet and said, "This couplet is elegant, but when used in a couplet in front of a restaurant, the word elegant is not enough." Without pausing, he continued, "There is such a couplet in Hanjiang restaurant in Chaozhou. The first couplet is Han Yu sent the poor, Lu Ling was drunk, the second couplet is Zhang Yan wrote a poem, and Wan King climbed up the building." The charming woman behind the little maid nodded and said, "A couplet uses 4 allusions and embeds Hanjiang restaurant in it. Although the couplet itself is not outstanding, it is used in front of this restaurant. But it couldn't be more appropriate." Tang Ning then spoke, "There is also a couplet like this in front of the Tao Tao Ju in Zhangzhou. The first couplet is Tao Qian is good at drinking, Yi Ya is good at cooking, and he drinks and cooks with moderation. The second couplet is Tao Gan cherishes every inch, Xia Yu cherishes every inch, and every inch is measured." The charming woman thought for a while and said, "Tao Qian loves wine, he is a romantic hermit, Yi Ya is good at cooking, but he is a traitor and a treacherous minister. Tao Gan once said, the sage Yu cherished every inch of yin. As for everyone, he should cherish every yin." It not only points out that drinking and entertainment must be moderate, not to indulge in fun and waste time, but also embeds the word Dao Tao into it, which is also a rare good couplet. Tang Ning didn't expect that this woman could point out all the allusions and instantly analyze the meaning of the 2 couplets. She couldn't help but look at her twice before saying, "So I say, although the couplet of naturally living can be called elegant, but it is just ordinary. Compared with the previous 2 couplets, although the artistic conception is sufficient, it lacks a sense of intention and is not a wonderful match." "Young master makes sense." The charming woman looked at her and suddenly asked, "I wonder if young master has any suggestions on this?" No. Tang Ning shook her head and said simply, "It is better to do less than to do more. He just wants to go in for dinner early. He wonders if this natural meal is as legendary as Xiaoju said." The little maid smiled and said, "You can't think of anything better. It turns out that you can only move your mouth. Who can't just talk?" Tang Ning's footsteps paused again. What does it mean that he can only move his mouth, but he can't move anywhere in his body? If this little maid was a maid of the Zhong family, Tang Ning would have asked Tang Yao Yao to spank his butt to become swollen. He looked at the charming woman, thought for a while, and said, "Suddenly a couplet came to mind. Since your place is called Tianatianju, a guest comes to Tianatianju, but a guest from heaven. What does the girl think of this couplet? A guest in nature, a guest in heaven. Before the charming woman could speak, Xiao Ju said with a look of surprise, one of them is reading it upright and the other is reading it backwards. Is this okay? He looked at Tang Ning impatiently and asked, what's down there? Tang Ning looked at him, shook her head and said, it's gone down there. The charming woman stood there and pondered this couplet carefully. This couplet not only embeds the three words natural residence in it, but is also novel in form. The best thing is that the phrase unexpectedly a guest from heaven is invisible. Giving a handful of guests to the door will make them feel good out of thin air. This couplet can be called a wonderful one. If it spreads, Tianranju's reputation will not be limited to the capital. A strange color gradually appeared on the charming woman's face. She looked at Tang Ning, gave a slight salute, and asked, I wonder if the young master has a second line. Tang Ning shook her head and said, no more. There was a trace of regret on the charming woman's face. After thinking for a moment, she looked at the little maid behind her and said, Xiao Tao, let me put on the couplet tomorrow. The little maid looked at her and asked doubtfully, but miss, where is the second couplet? The charming woman smiled and said, just hang up the upper couplet. If any guest can match the lower couplet, all the expenses at Tianranju will be waived that day. Tang Ning took another look at the woman. She was able to think of this kind of marketing method in a short time. No wonder she was able to manage Tianranju to become famous in the capital. When Tang Ning and Li Tianlan walked in, Li Tianlan turned her head and asked him, are you really not sorry? A guest comes to live in nature, but he is a guest from heaven. When a person passes by a big Buddhist temple, the Buddha in the temple is bigger than the person. How about this couplet? Li Tianlan thought for a while and said, it's barely a match, but it's a bit vulgar and the artistic conception is a bit off. It's too vulgar, but I want artistic conception. Then listen to the sentence again. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, the guest lives in nature, but he is a guest in heaven. The monk travels to the Yunyan temple, and the monk hides in the temple and wanders in the clouds. How about, I have the artistic conception? Li Tianlan glanced at him and said, why didn't you say anything just now? Tang Ning shook her head and said, it's young Master Xiao who's treating us anyway, so aren't we trying to steal his limelight? Master, stay here. Several people had just walked into the garden when a voice came from behind. Tang Ning turned around, and the charming woman came over, handed over a small jade plaque, and said, young master gave Tiantianju such a wonderful couplet. It's such a small gift, it's not respectful. Tang Ning took the jade token, and the woman bowed to him again, moved her steps lightly, and left slowly. Tang Ning weighed the jade plaque in her hand and asked doubtfully, what is this? Is it valuable? Don't give it to me. Xiao Ju reached for it, and Tang Ning immediately put the jade token away. Even Mr. Xiao is so jealous, this brand must be worth a lot of money. Hangzhou Pavilion gave jade plagues, and Tianranju also gave jade plagues. In this regard, the capital was indeed more particular than Lingzhou. Xiao Ju looked at him and said angrily, you are treating me today. Tang Ning asked in surprise, why? With this brand, you can eat all the delicacies of Tianranju without paying. Xiao Ju said with some jealousy, do you know the status of the people who own this brand? Neither did you. No. Didn't you say that there is nothing you can do in the capital that you, Mr. Xiao, can't handle? How come you don't even have a sign? I don't care, you're treating me today anyway. Xiao Ju was shocked, waved his hand and said, it's free anyway, I'm going to eat all the signature dishes here today. Natural residence, a small pavilion somewhere. The maid named Xiao Tao looked at the charming woman and asked puzzledly, miss, he is not an important person, why should you give him a jade medal? Young Master Xiao, who has always been a loner, walked so close to him and treated the beggar with respect, who is collecting the information in Lingzhou. Let her come and report to me in person later. There was a trace of doubt on the face of the charming woman, and then she shook her head and said, Ling Zhou is resolved, the Tang family abandons their son, and the imperial decree rewards, the Tang family's pond is a bit muddy, it's just a jade plaque, not what a valuable thing, maybe there will be a big reward in the future. After saying that, she added, when people pass by the great Buddha temple, the Buddha in the temple is bigger than others, the monks visit Yunyan temple, and the temple is hidden in the clouds. Monks, remember to hang these two couplets on the wall next to you tomorrow. This Tang Jiwen is really good at it. Hidden clumsiness. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 129. The main building of Tianrunju is built on the water and covers a very large area. There are passages from all directions of the small lake leading to the main building. After entering the main building, Tang Ning threw the sign to Xiaoju, and soon a servant respectfully took them to a room upstairs. When she came up, Tang Ning noticed that the crowd below was bustling and very lively, so she casually asked, "What are you doing down there?" "The Lantern Festival Poetry Party," Xiaoju said casually after sitting down. In order to attract customers, AncientChina holds a Lantern Festival Poetry Party every year on the Lantern Festival. The leader can win generous prizes. I don't know what this year's prize will be. Judging from their appearance, they should be quite thin. As soon as Xiaoju finished speaking, a burst of noise suddenly came from outside the door. At the entrance of the accord, a waiter asked, "Two young gentlemen, there are already distinguished guests in this accord. I will give you another room." A young man looked at him with a frown and asked, "We obviously came early, why didn't we let them change?" Xiaoju opened the door and walked out, asking, "What to change?" "Young Master Xiao." When he saw Xiaoyu coming out, the young man's expression changed slightly and he looked at the young man behind him. The young man smiled, cupped his hands and said, "It's a misunderstanding. Since it's young Master Xiao, we can just go somewhere else." Tang Ning saw Xiaoju stand up and walk out, then walked in again after a while, thinking that the matter had been resolved. He asked casually, "What's going on?" Xiaoju waved his hand and said, "The young master of the Minister of Rights and the second young master of the Tang family are competing with us for positions. The second young master of the Tang family does not have such a big reputation, so it is better to ask his eldest brother to come. Ignore them and order the food first bar." Tang Ning paused while flipping through the menu, then looked up at him, "Second young master of the Tang family." Xiaoju nodded and said, "Tang Zhao is the son of Tang Qi, a native of Dongda." Tang Ning handed the menu to Xiaoju, glanced outside the door, and said, "You come here often, please order." After Xiaoju ordered the food, he stood up and opened a window in the accord. Standing in front of the window, he could see the situation below. Countless people gathered in front of a high platform. There were many seats on the platform, and people were already taking them. In the middle were a few dancing women. After watching the dance in Hongxiu Pavilion, and looking at this ordinary dance, I always felt that I owed something. In another pavilion. After Lu Li sat down, he shook his head and said, "I don't know why Mr. Xiao is here to join in the fun. This location is far inferior to their place." The young man behind him waved his hand and asked, "How did you go about the thing I asked you to do?" Lu Li had a look of embarrassment on his face and said, "I don't know why, but my men lost the man yesterday, but don't worry, Shao, I have asked them to find him. There have been many people these 2 days. After the Lantern Festival, I will let them go to the inns and ask." Another young man in the accord showed curiosity on his face and asked, "Who is the second young master looking for? Do you need my help?" Luli looked at him, was startled for a moment, then patted his head and said, "Yes, I would have forgotten if you didn't tell me. Your father is the magistrate of Ping'an County, and this is your territory. It's not easy to find someone." The young man looked at him and said, "Let's not mention this matter for now. Have you finished what I asked you to do?" Luli patted his chest and said, "There are so many people in the capital. If you just throw a brick, you can hit 2 people who can write poems. I found someone to write the Shangyuan poems half a month ago. There are 10 poems in total. The quality is outstanding, excellent, and I also bribed a judge to ensure that we will only have 3 songs short of being selected. Don't worry, no one can compete with us this time." Chang Yu said with some surprise, "Tianrunju is really willing to give up this time. The leader of this poetry meeting can actually spend an hour with Miss Sume. I don't know how many people in the capital are looking forward to this opportunity. I'm afraid tonight will be a battle between dragons and tigers." Luli had a look of expectation on his face and said, "It is said that at this hour, I can still make some modest demands to Miss Sume. If I were me, I would ask her to play a piece for me. Her xiaosheng has a magical sound. I have long wanted to see what kind of magic voice it is, but unfortunately I have never had the chance." The young man looked at him and said, "If I can come out on top this time, I'll let you see it later." "Then thank you in advance, second young master." The main building of Tianrunju has 2 floors. The loft upstairs and the lobby downstairs have completely different atmospheres. Young officials gathered in groups around the table, looking at the high platform above and whispering, "Brother Chen, how about the song you just played? I'm afraid there's not much hope." "Brother Chen, please be humble. You have been sculpting this poem for several months. How come there is no hope? So what if I have been working on it for several months?" The second son of the Tang family came up with 10 songs at once. 3 of the 10 were selected, and they were all ranked at the top. "How can this compare?" A young man patted the table with a slightly angry expression, "Who doesn't know that they all bought their poems, and in order to get the top spot and win the chance to be alone with Miss Sume, they even did such a despicable thing? They can do it all, and as fellow scholars, I'm really ashamed of them." The person next to him shook his head and sighed, "Forget it, this kind of thing is not something we can participate in." In a pavilion upstairs, several richly dressed men were stunned for a long time after hearing the news brought by their servants from below. "Is Tang Zhao ranked first? That shameless Tang Zhao bought 10 songs. If he can compose a song, I will take his surname. Doesn't he have no shame at all?" Several people in the capital have quite a background, and this time they came for Sume. Although they also bought 2 poems, they were all secretive, and they knew that this was a bit shameless. "But I didn't expect that there is no most shameless, only more shameless. Buying 10 poems at a time, the second son of the Tang family is simply shameless to the extreme." On the high platform, several old men also frowned. They were invited to be the judges of the Lantern Festival Poetry Festival. Because everyone has different preferences, it is difficult to distinguish the poems. Their task is to select the 10 best poems from all the poems tonight, and finally Miss Sume will personally select the one she thinks is the best. Anyone whose poems are selected as the top 10 has a chance. Of course, the more poems are included in the top 10, the greater the possibility of being selected by Miss Sume. One of them stroked his long beard and said, "Second young master of the Tang family, this time he is a little bit out of line." Another one shook his head and said, "He alone has 3 poems selected, which is a bit too blatant." An old man in green raised his eyes and looked at the 2 of them, and said, "We just need to review the poems. We can't and dare not intervene in the matters above. Regardless of other things, these 3 poems are indeed qualified to be selected." Several people shook their heads and continued to look down at the poems handed over by everyone. Xiaoju was halfway through his meal when he went downstairs for a walk. When he came back and just sat down, he shook his head and said, Tang Zhao is too shameless. He actually bought 10 poems. It seems that he is determined to win the prize this time. Tang Ning put down his chopsticks, looked at him and asked, is the prize very generous this time? More than generous. Whoever wins the first prize this year will be proud of the whole capital. Xiao Yu said with some regret, if I had known that Tianranju would actually take this out as a prize, I would have bought 20 poems from him. It would be worth spending any money. He shook his head and said, where is Xiao Fu? Come and pour me some wine. Okay, a voice came from behind him. Xiao Ju's face changed greatly. He turned around and glared at him, and shouted, how many times have I told you not to stand behind me in the future? If you stand behind me again, I will break your legs. I'm done eating, you guys eat slowly. Tang Ning wiped his mouth, stood up and walked to the window, sitting at a small table with pens, ink, paper and inkstone on the table. Sitting here, looking out the window, the high platform below is in full view, and the voices of people's discussions are also clearly audible. This time, I'm afraid that Master Tang Zhao will win the first prize. There's nothing I can do. Who can blame him for being rich and shameless? It's like this every year. What's the point of Tianranju's Lantern Festival poetry meeting? Tang Zhao. This second young master of the Tang family should be the one who instigated the son of the Minister of Rights to make them run half of the capital in vain and deliberately disgust people. Tang Ning sighed lightly, then spread out a piece of paper and picked up a pen. Enemies meet on a narrow road. Who doesn't know how to disgust people? Li Tianlan also stood up and left the table, standing beside him and watching. A hint of light first appeared in her eyes. Soon, the light turned into surprise. Then, the surprise turned into shock. After a while, the shock began to turn into numbness. After an unknown amount of time, Tang Ning moved her wrist, waved to the servant standing beside Xiaoju, and said, Xiao Fu, come here. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 130. In the elegant pavilion, in front of the window, Li Tianlan sat opposite Tang Ning and had been looking at him for a long time. Tang Ning looked up at her. After a moment, Li Tianlan couldn't help asking, what do you want to do? He had just written 10 poems, and she watched him write 10 poems. When he wrote the first poem, she felt that his reputation as a poet was indeed well deserved. When he wrote the second poem, she felt that his poetry was even better than the rumors. When he wrote the third poem, she thought he was the best poet she knew. When he wrote the 10th poem, she thought he was crazy. Such a high-profile release of 10 excellent Changyuan poems did not seem like something that someone who often said a little bit of knowledge would do. I just came to the capital, and my travel expenses are almost gone. I use this method to earn some money. Tang Ning looked at her and explained, write a few more poems, it's safe. Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, do you think I will believe it? Tang Ning pointed out the window, pointing to another elegant pavilion, and said, I have a blood feud with the Tang family in the capital. The second young master of the Tang family is sitting there. That shameless guy bought 10 poems and wanted to win the first prize tonight. I don't want to see him proud, so I will use these poems to kill him. It's that simple. Li Tianlan looked at him for a long time, then said, if you don't have enough money, tell me and I will give it to you. You are disgraceful by doing this. A real man should face difficulties and solve his own problems when he encounters difficulties. If he even needs women to give him living expenses, what has he become? Since ancient times, the Lantern Festival has been a very important festival. There are countless poems about the Lantern Festival. Even if Sushi, Qingguan, Xinkiji, Wangxiu, and other ancient people who existed cannot be copied, there is still half of the Tang dynasty missing, and Miss Qingzhao has never appeared. The Ming dynasty has a 300 years of national life. How many poems can be copied? Sorry, Kui Ye, the imperial censor, sorry, Miss Jingzhao, sorry, Sister Shuhen, sorry, Dongyang University scholar. Throwing out works of different styles from various dynasties and poets at once, it is an insult to civility. This is a tenfold split personality, or in layman's terms, a mental illness. But since you have decided to do it, you must make it foolproof. Li Tianlan looked at him and didn't ask any more questions. He looked in the direction of the elegant pavilion he had just pointed to. Tianrunju, on the high platform of the main hall. A white-haired old man took a sip of tea and asked, "Are there any more poems to be sent up?" No, the old man in green looked around and said, "It's almost time, why not decide on these 10 poems and ask Miss Sume to come out?" "That's what I was thinking." The white-haired old man nodded and just stood up when someone suddenly ran up to the platform and put a stack of papers on the table in front of him. "You're taking it out now, what were you doing just now?" The white-haired old man looked at him, frowned and said, "Today's poetry gathering is not accepting new works, you can take it." Xiao Fu thought about it, looked at him and said, "Then I'll go back and tell Xiao Gonggai that today's poetry gathering is not accepting new works." The white-haired old man was stunned for a moment, looked at him again, pursed his lips, and said, "The Lantern Festival poetry gathering only happens once a year, and it's not easy to get the chance, so I'll make an exception today." Xiaoju, Xiao Gonggai, is someone he can't afford to offend. He even thought in his heart that as long as this poem is not too bad, he will give him face and put it in these 10 poems to prevent Xiao Gonggai from causing trouble for him in the future. He looked down, his face slightly different, and sat down again, looking at the people around him, and said, "Come and take a look. Don't urge the jade clock and silver pot, the iron gate and golden lock are completely opened. Who can sit idle when seeing the moon? Where can you not come to see the lanterns?" One person stroked his beard and said, "Yes, this is the first quatrain I saw today." In just a few words, it describes the grand occasion of the Lantern Festival in the capital. Master Xiao bought, and wrote this poem. It's not bad. In the Tang dynasty, Kuiya had 5 poems of Shangyuan Night, which was a masterpiece. Both are 7-character quatrains, and this poem seems to be even better. You have also thought of this. If this poem is put together with it, I would have thought that Kuiya had written 6 poems of Shangyuan Night. In that case, this poem should be included in the top 10. It should be included. It can be ranked first among the top 10. The white-haired old man nodded and said, "If this poem is included, 1 poem should be eliminated from the 10 poems." He thought for a while and said, "Tang Zhao's last poem Yuan Ri is ranked last among the top 10. Let's use this Shangyuan Night to replace his Yuan Ri. Do you have any objections?" Everyone nodded. The green-shirted old man glanced in the direction of a certain elegant pavilion and responded, "It should be so." Then, the white-haired old man handed over the poem and was about to speak when he was stunned. He looked at his hand and said in surprise, "There is more." He looked at a poem written on the second piece of paper and his expression was stunned. As if he realized something, he put the second piece of paper aside and looked at the third one. Then the fourth one. The fifth one. The 10th one. 10 exactly. After coming to his senses, he sat down on the table, his eyes looking towards a certain elegant pavilion upstairs. In the pavilion, Xiao Ju looked at Xiao Fu who came in from outside and asked, "Where have you been?" Xiao Fu immediately said, "My lord, I sent a few poems for Mr. Tang." Xiao Ju looked at Tang Ning in surprise and asked, "Are you also interested in the prizes of Tianrunju this time?" "Nonsense, who is not interested in money? He is not Tang Yao Yao, who has such a rich father, nor is he Xiao Ju, who has a huge family fortune and no worries about food and drink." He looked at Xiao Ju and asked, "How much money will they give if I can win the first prize?" How much? Xiaoju looked at him in surprise and said, it seems to be 1,000 taels. Tianrunju will offer 1,000 taels of silver to the champion of the poetry competition. This is mainly for those students from poor families. Children of noble families like Tang Zhao must be attracted by the opportunity to be alone with Su Mei and make friends with her. Tianrunju has been based in the capital for so many years, and its network of relationships is extremely complex. Being able to connect with Su Mei, the owner of Tianrunju, is not something that can be measured by a mere 1,000 or 10,000 taels of silver. 1,000 taels. Tang Ning thought that he could make many rich children with deep backgrounds in the capital, including Xiaoju, interested, and the reward would be at least 10,000 taels. Unexpectedly, he only gave 1,000 taels, which was too far from what he expected. He underestimated the stinginess of Tianrunju and overestimated the pursuit of the children of the noble families in the capital. However, he had not thought about the so-called reward. No matter how small a mosquito is, it is still meat, and 1,000 taels is also a huge sum of money for him. Another elegant pavilion. The young man named Tang Zhao frowned and asked, only 2 songs left. Lu Li said awkwardly, originally there were 3 songs, but at the last minute, Xiao Xiaogong also sent one. Those people probably didn't want to lose his face, so they sent him up to make up the number. He smiled and continued, what's more, I have bribed most of the people who were selected. If Miss Su Mei chooses them, they will give us the opportunity. Hearing this, Tang Zhao's expression eased a little. On the high platform below, the faces of several judges were particularly complicated. The white-haired old man pursed his dry lips and asked, what should we do? A person beside him smiled bitterly and said, I don't know. They had already selected the final 10 works. But at the last minute, Xiao Xiaogongyi sent 10 more poems. Although none of them were signed, could they be sent from Xiao Xiaogongyi's room by other people? These 10 poems were all Lantern Festival poems, and the standard of each one was extremely high, making it difficult for them to choose. The poems were pastoral and frontier, and the poems were bold and graceful, with men's ambitions and women's feelings. There were simple descriptions of scenery, as well as descriptions of scenery and lyricism. There were passionate descriptions of the grand scenery of the Lantern Festival, praising the beautiful mountains and rivers, and there were also lonely and miserable poems, expressing mourning for the deceased husband. When did Xiao Xiaogongyi go to the border? When did his husband die? Even if it was a fabrication, it couldn't be made up like this. They thought that the second young master of the Tang family was shameless enough, but they didn't expect that when Xiao Xiaogongyi showed up, the second young master of the Tang family was not even qualified to carry his shoes. He was not only shameless, but extremely shameless.